Tom Perrotta taught creative writing at both Yale and Harvard. He had finished a book of short stories, Bad Haircut, and 2 novels before Bad Haircut was picked up by a publisher in 1994. His 1998 novel, Election, proved to be his breakout work, and it was made into a much-beloved film with Matthew Broderick and Reese Witherspoon. The theme of ordinary suburbanites trapped in lives they never imagined, and how many of us can relate to that, runs throughout Perrotta's novels. Success for his characters is always just out of reach, and the world is always just beyond their control. Characters who seem destined for success serve as foils to the true protagonists, as if constant reminders of the unfairness of life. Tom Perrotta is much admired for his razor-sharp observations of the human condition, his biting humor and satire, his compassion for what we are all up against in these trying times. Perrotta does not create caricatures. His novels work because he has a basic understanding that life is complex and everyone has a story if you take the time to listen. Just a few fun facts. The author does not eat eggs. He had a dog who lived to age 18, and The Great Gatsby is among the books that have been most influential to him. Tonight we're celebrating his new release, The Abstinence Teacher. And here's just a snippet from a review in the New York Times by Michiko Kakutani, almost as fun to say as Crescent Dragon Wagon. As formulaic as this plot might sound, Mr. Perrotta uses it not to construct a conventional screwball romance, but to create a sad, funny, touching story that looks at the frustrations and perils of life in suburbia through darkly tinted, not rose-colored glasses. A story similar in tone and setting to his last novel, Little Children, 2004. A native of Garwood, New Jersey, Mr. Perrotta now resides in Belmont, Massachusetts. The author of the superb new novel, The Abstinence Teacher, Tom Perrotta.
Thanks. That was a very nice introduction. I appreciate it. It's very nice to be back in Atlanta and at the Margaret Mitchell House. My brother lives here in Atlanta, his wife as well, and my nephew and her niece, so it's very nice to have family here. Usually I just read, and when I came here the last time, they said, it's probably not, our audience likes it when you talk about the book, and it actually turned out to be a really interesting thing for me to come here and think about how Little Children got put together, where I started, and how it changed as I wrote. And so I'll try to do something similar tonight, and I'll just read you little bits to illustrate some of the points I'm trying to make. This book was conceived in the aftermath of the 2004 election. And I should say that my novel Election was actually also conceived in the wake of a presidential election. It was after the 92 election where there were the 3 candidates. There was Clinton, the elder George Bush, and then Ross Perot, who was a sort of wild card. And that was the inspiration for the character of Tammy. She was Ross Perot. And in this book, I guess that in 2004, I was just so keenly aware of just how sharp the culture war had become, how clear it was that people on different sides of that red-blue divide saw the country. They basically were living in different realities, it seemed to me. I live outside of Boston, which means I live in the one state in the U.S. where gay marriage is legal. And so it's just sort of a reality that we live with. So our kids will go to school with gay couples who have kids, and it's just sort of a matter-of-fact thing. And yet, in that election, particularly, as you know, in the South and in Midwestern swing states, there were a lot of evangelical values voters who were, very upset about the possibility of gay marriage and really saw it as, this threat to American civilization. And, I was just surrounded by people who'd say, who are these people? And I think probably down here it was similar. People would look at each other from afar and just think, how is it that we live in the same country? And it seemed to me as a novelist that was an interesting place to start, that I would, that would be a really interesting thing if I could write a novel that somehow was able to get inside the culture war from both sides. And so what I wanted to do is to create a little microcosm in one town that, kind of reflected the reality in the entire country. So I really did start with this kind of, not with a character and not with a story, but with an impulse to get the culture war into a novel. And so then it became a question of, okay, how do I do this? And I obviously needed some issue or controversy. And you could imagine one could write about gay marriage, one could write about abortion, one could write about evolution versus intelligent design, just for example. But it just so happened, and this is something that has occurred a number of times in my writing life, that I had a scrap of paper where I had written an idea down, and I'll mention it later. I realize I'm getting ahead of myself. But I had a sort of idea about what issue I would use. And that was, I'll say, it was basically years ago. I remember being at my kid's soccer game and seeing the girls after the game. They're sort of sitting in a circle, and it looked to me like they were praying. And I just had this sudden image of, what if you were at a youth soccer game and your kid's coach led the team in a prayer, and you were not in favor of that? What would you do? So that was just some idea that was just stuck in the back of my head, and it got dislodged when I wanted to write this novel. Somehow, though, I was also very interested in sex education and abstinence. There had been a lot of controversy, even in Massachusetts. An organization called the Silver Ring Thing had come up there, and they were doing presentations in schools. And that's an organization where kids will pledge to remain chaste until their marriage, and they'll wear a ring to symbolize that pledge. And there was a legal case where someone sued, saying that this was a religious organization and therefore couldn't use public funding to give presentation in schools. And so I was aware of that controversy, and somehow, because I'm very interested in high school and pretty interested in sex, as people who read Little Children know, I found myself drawn to that. And the basic scenario of the book was that there's a teacher named Ruth Ramsey, and she's a liberal feminist sex education teacher in an unnamed northeastern, well, it's not unnamed, it's called Stonewood Heights, but you don't know what state it's in. It's sort of like Springfield on The Simpsons. It's somewhere out there. Yeah, it's right next to Springfield, actually. And she makes a comment in class that's either, depending upon your perspective, completely innocuous or ill-advised or really scandalous. And there's an activist evangelical church in her town that sees it as scandalous, and they go after Ruth. And I'll just read you a little section that sort of sets this scene in the town. It was her own fault, she thought, for not having seen the trouble brewing. The atmosphere in the school and around town had changed a lot in the past couple of years. A small evangelical church, the Tabernacle of the Gospel Truth, led by a fiery young preacher named Pastor Dennis, had begun a crusade to cleanse Stonewood Heights of all manner of godlessness and moral decay. Pastor Dennis and a small band of the faithful had held a successful series of demonstrations outside of Mike's World of Video, convincing the owner, Mike's son Jerry, to close down a small adults-only section in the back of the store. The church had also protested the town's use of banners that said Happy Holidays instead of Merry Christmas. Tabernacle members had spoken out against the teaching of evolution at school board meetings. and initiated a drive to ban several Judy Blume novels from the middle school library, including Are You There, God? It's Me, Margaret, one of Ruth's all-time favorites. Randall, this is Ruth's friend, he's a gay librarian. Randall had spoken out against censorship at the meeting and had been personally attacked in the Stonewood Bulletin Chronicle by Pastor Dennis, who said that it should come as no surprise to find immoral books in the school library when the school system placed immoral people in positions of authority. They've given the inmates control of the asylum, Pastor Dennis observed. Is it any wonder they're making insane decisions? But the good guys had won that battle. The school board had voted 5-4 to keep Judy Blume on the shelves. In any event, Ruth had foolishly chosen to view these skirmishes as a series of isolated incidents, storms that flared up and blew over, rather than seeing them for what they were, the climate in which she now lived. Her second mistake wasn't thinking of herself as invulnerable, somehow beyond attack. She'd been teaching high school sex ed for more than a decade and had become a beloved figure, or so she liked to think, for the unflappable, matter-of-fact candor with which she discussed the most sensitive of subjects. She believed, it was her personal credo, that pleasure is good, shame is bad, and knowledge is power. She saw it as her mission to demystify sex for the teenagers of Stonewood Heights. She was doing what any good teacher did, leading her students into the light, opening them up to new ways of thinking, giving them the vital information they needed to live their lives in the most rewarding way possible. And in doing so, she had earned more than her fair share of respect and affection from the kids who passed through her classroom, and some measure of gratitude from the community as a whole. What happens, I won't give away too much because I hope that you'll actually read it, but Ruth comes under attack and basically loses her battle, and her job is sort of changed dramatically, and she's asked to teach abstinence, which is not something she believes in, but it's what she has to do, and it makes her extremely angry. And it also happens at a time in her life which is somewhat difficult. She's divorced and kind of lonely. So there's a kind of basic irony here where you have this, liberal sex education teacher who feels like, believes that sex is just one of the great things in life, but actually has a very unsatisfying love life at the moment and a kind of, sad history in love. So, and then you have a Christian character who's the other main character of the book, a guy named Tim, who is a musician who's had a drug problem and is trying to live on the straight and narrow and actually has a much too interesting sex life. But what I want to do is I'll read you a section here where Ruth and Tim meet for the first time. I marked everything very carefully. Ruth goes to a soccer game of her daughter's, and it's the first time she goes. Normally she lets her ex-husband handle all the youth sports activities, but her daughter's playing on a very good team and has made sure that she came to this game. The score was still tied at halftime, but the Stars seemed relaxed and silly on the sideline, as if they'd already won. Several players were fussing over a black lab puppy with a purple bandana around its neck. 3 others were teaching a dance routine. It combined elements of the Macarena, the swim, and the bump to their coaches, an incongruous pair who seemed genuinely interested in mastering the complicated sequence of moves. After a moment of uncertainty, Ruth recognized the bulkier of the 2 men as John Roper, Candace's dad, though he'd lost most of his hair and put on 50 pounds since she'd first seen him dropping off his daughter at Little Learners 7 years ago. She didn't know the other coach. He was younger, unexpectedly hippie-ish for Stonewood Heights, a small, compact man whose dark hair could easily have been gathered into a respectable ponytail. Oblivious to the festivities, Ruth's daughter Maggie sat on the grass nearby, caught up in conversation with her friend Nadima, a Pakistani-American girl with huge brown eyes and disconcertingly skinny legs. Nadima was scowling thoughtfully, nodding the way you do when you want your friend to understand what she's saying and sympathize with her. Nodding the way you do when you want your friend to know that you understand what she's saying and sympathize with her position, even if you don't completely agree with her. Ruth approached cautiously, hoping she might be able to overhear a few scraps of conversation. They looked so endearingly serious, like grown women discussing a complicated relationship or a thorny problem at work. But her cover was blown by Hannah Friedman, who glanced up while scratching the puppy's belly. "Hi, Mrs. Maggie's mother," she called out in a loud, stagey voice. Unlike most of the girls on the team, they were 11 and under after all, Hannah had already begun to develop breasts and an annoying adolescent personality to go along with them. "Hi," Ruth replied, uncomfortably aware of several faces turning in her direction at once. "You girls are doing great." With a cry of delight, Maggie scrambled to her feet and rushed over to her mother, greeting her with a hug several orders of magnitude stronger than usual. Ruth squeezed back, feeling the clamminess of her daughter's skin through the mesh weave of her jersey. "Mommy!" Maggie's voice sounded as theatrical as Hannah's, but her eyes were full of honest emotion. "Thanks for coming." "Happy to be here," Ruth told her. "I'm sorry it took so long." Maggie stepped back from the embrace, tugging at her uniform to get everything back in order. Ruth was unexpectedly moved by the sight of her, as if she were being offered a glimpse of two Maggies at once. The little girl she still was, a dirty-kneed tomboy straight out of Norman Rockwell, and the happy, confident young woman she was already on her way to becoming. "Did you see when I scored?" she asked, kicking an imaginary ball. "The goalie dove, but it went right through her hands." Ruth frowned. "Sorry, honey, I got here a little late, but I can't believe how well you're playing. You're like the Energizer Bunny out there. I'm so proud of you." "You should be," said a man's voice. "She's our spark plug." Ruth turned and saw the long-haired coach approaching with a friendly expression and a slight bounce in his step, probably a byproduct of the dance lesson. "Can I interest you in an apple slice?" he asked, extending a Tupperware container. The girls barely made a dent. Maggie took one, but Ruth declined. "You sure?" The coach looked put out by her refusal. "They're nice and fresh. I squeeze lemon juice on them so they don't turn brown." "Good thinking," said Ruth. "Can't go wrong with lemon juice." Nodding as if she'd uttered a profound truth, the coach shifted the container to his left hand and extended his right. "Tim Mason. I'm the leader of this motley crew." They shook. His hand was unusually large and a lot warmer than hers. "I'm Ruth, Maggie's mother." Keeping a firm grip on Ruth's hand, Tim Mason studied her face, as if she were a good friend he hadn't seen in a long time. Up close, he looked older than she'd expected, at least 40. Some gray hair, crow's feet, a certain wariness around the eyes. "I've heard a lot about you," he said. Ruth chuckled nervously, glad she'd taken the time to shower and put on makeup before leaving the house. "Good things, I hope." Tim Mason didn't answer, nor did he loosen his grip. He just kept staring at Ruth, the moment stretching out, the air smelling like apples. "It means a lot to her that you're here," he said. "I know how much she's missed you." When he released her hand, Ruth felt relieved and vaguely let down at the same time. "Well, thanks for coaching," she said. "I know it's a big time commitment." "I love it," he said, turning to Maggie and ruffling her hair. "We got a great bunch of kids." Ruth wasn't sure why the brief encounter with Tim Mason had left her so flustered. It was nothing really, just some innocuous small talk and a handshake that lasted a little too long with a guy she wasn't even sure she found all that attractive. He was handsome enough, but she always found something vaguely off-putting about long hair on a middle-aged man. And yet here she was, all hot and bothered at the beginning of the second half, staring right through the players on the field to the coach on the far sideline. He was holding a clipboard, banging it against his leg like a tambourine, unable to think of anything but the pressure of his palm against hers and the way time seemed to stop when he looked in her eyes. It was embarrassing, she understood that, pining for your daughter's married soccer coach. Oh, she checked for the ring. She always checked for the ring. Possibly a new low. Not that it was her fault. This was the kind of thing that happened when you went without love for too long. After a while, any scrap of male attention, a wry smile, a kind word, the faintest whiff of flirtation, was enough to create a full-blown disturbance in your love-starved brain. A guy says, "Excuse me," in the supermarket. Well, he must be the one. Your last chance for happiness. Or, barring that, because happiness was a pretty tall order, your last chance for a normally unhappy life where somebody at least touches you every week or two. What made it more ridiculous was that it wasn't even mid-morning yet, and Tim Mason was already her second last chance of the day. During the night, she got so worked up thinking about her high school boyfriend Paul Caruso and their long-lost interlude of secret passion that she'd done something she already regretted. Dragging herself out of bed at 3 a.m, she'd logged on to classmates.com and posted a query on the Oakhurst Regional High message board. Does anyone know how to get in touch with Paul Caruso, class of 80? He was a trumpet player who lived on Peony Road. What was that, 6 hours ago? And already she'd dumped her old lover for a hippie soccer coach who would undoubtedly be replaced by the surly Russian guy with liquor on his breath who pumped her gas at the Hess station. Is this what it's going to be like for the rest of my life, Ruth wondered? One unrequited fantasy after another until I shrivel up and die. She was rescued from this unrewarding line of inquiry by the sudden appearance at her side of Arlene Zabel, a striking woman of about 50, whose daughter Louisa played goalie for the Stars. Arlene had long gray hair that only heightened your awareness of how youthful she looked otherwise. Her body trim and girlish, her face lively and unlined. "Ruth," she said, "it's been ages." Ruth agreed that it had. Arlene gave her an approving once-over as they exchanged pleasantries. "You look terrific. Did you lose weight?" "I've been running," Ruth explained, "mainly just to keep sane." Arlene nodded sympathetically, as if she understood exactly why Ruth might have needed to take steps to preserve her sanity. She was a tax attorney turned massage therapist, a true renegade given the narrow parameters of acceptable adult conduct in Stonewood Heights, and Ruth had always considered her a kindred spirit. "I've been meaning to call you for months," Arlene said, "but you know how it is. Mel's been traveling for work, and I run around so much I barely have time to breathe." "That's okay," Ruth told her. "I've been pretty busy myself." The falseness of the moment was painfully apparent to both of them. 4 years ago, they'd been good friends. They'd had each other's families over for dinner, went on double dates with their husbands, took the kids to movies, museums, and amusement parks. But Frank had known Mel since high school, and it was tacitly understood by everyone involved that he would get custody of the Zabels after the divorce. Ruth and Arlene tried to sustain an independent friendship for a while, but it had petered out after a couple of melancholy coffee dates. "It's a shame what they did to you," Arlene said. And here she's talking about the tabernacle and how they affected Ruth's job. "It's a shame what they did to you," Arlene said. "You didn't deserve to be raked over the coals like that." "Thanks." Ruth appreciated the sentiment, though she would have appreciated it a whole lot more a few months ago, back when the coals were still burning. "I don't know where all these Bible thumpers are coming from," Arlene said. "I mean, they didn't used to be so." Uh-oh. Ruth looked up just in time to see one of the Comets steal the ball from Nadima and boot it upfield. A roar of anticipation went up from the Bridgeton fans as their star offensive player dribbled past Hannah Friedman and broke for the net. Alone in the goal, Louisa Zabel seemed jittery, uncertain whether to hold her ground or rush forward and force a shot. "Oh God," Arlene said, grabbing hold of Ruth's wrist. The Comet player had a wide-open shot from 10 feet out, but she drilled the ball straight at Louisa, who swatted it away with her gloved hands, then dove for the rebound, curling her body around the ball before the shooter could follow up. "Way to go, Lulu," Arlene screamed. "Get it out of there." Louisa leapt to her feet, sprinted forward, and flung the ball almost to midfield. "Wow," said Ruth. "She's got quite an arm." "This game's going to give me a heart attack," Arlene said. "What was I saying?" "Bible thumpers." Forget it. She waved her hand in disgust. "I'm sick of talking about it. The whole world's going nuts." "It's the kids who are being cheated," Ruth pointed out. "You've got a small group of fanatics telling everybody else what they can and can't do, what they should and shouldn't read or talk about. Where's it going to end? I wish it were a small group of fanatics. I'm starting to think there's more of them than us. I mean, they're running the country. It's only because they're louder, Ruth said. The people on our side aren't speaking out. It's like we're a bunch of wimps who don't believe in anything. The Stars had a throw-in. Nadima raised the ball high over her head and heaved it into an empty space in the center of the field, a little bit ahead of one of her teammates, a quick, dark-haired girl Ruth had never seen before, who came streaking out of nowhere to meet it. Unfortunately, one of the comets, number 14, arrived from the opposite direction at exactly the same time. It was a sickening thing to watch, the two players crashing into each other at full speed, both going down hard. The bigger girl got up right away. She was crying and clutching her midsection, but Maggie's teammate remained motionless on the ground. Tim Mason and John Roper came running onto the field before the ref had even blown the whistle. "Who got hurt?" Ruth asked. "That's Abby, Tim's daughter." Arlene drew an anxious breath. "I hope she's okay. Last week a girl from Willard Falls broke her collarbone. They had to take her away in an ambulance." The players took a knee while the coaches attended to Abby. Tim Mason crouched at his daughter's side, his hand resting lightly on her shoulder. He addressed a worried comment to his assistant, who nodded grimly and signaled to the ref. By this point, the Bridgeton coach had wandered onto the field to see if he could help. "This is scary," Arlene said. At almost the same moment, though, Tim's face broke into a dazzling smile of relief as Abby pushed herself into sitting position and held out a hand. In a single smooth motion, her father hoisted her up from the ground and cradled her in his arms. He asked a question. She nodded yes. The spectators applauded as they made their way slowly across the field. "He seems like a nice guy," said Ruth. "Who, Tim?" "Yeah, I just met him a little while ago." "He's good with the girls," Arlene said a bit stiffly. Ruth couldn't help herself. "I actually thought he was kind of cute. I mean, I know he's married and everything." "You're joking, right?" "He's a little short," Ruth conceded, "but he's got a good build." Arlene hesitated for a moment, apparently trying to decide if Ruth was pulling her leg. "You know he's one of them, right?" "One of who?" "That church, tabernacle, whatever you call it." "Really? He doesn't seem the type." "Ask him," Arlene said. "He'll be happy to tell you all about it." Oh, Ruth laughed, remembering the way the coach had held her hand and stared into her eyes. He hadn't wanted her body. He'd wanted her soul. I'm such an idiot. Arlene patted her on the shoulder. "We got to find you a boyfriend." Now, the second half of the book, or second part of the book is 4 or 5 parts, with a very long part that describes Tim Mason and how he got into this church. And as I said before, he's sort of an unlikely figure, or actually not unlikely person in a Christian church, but maybe not people's stereotype sense of who he is. I mean, he's had a really difficult past. He's had a drug problem, and his wife kicked him out, and he's just getting back on his feet with the help of this pastor who's really taken a very powerful interest in him. And the pastor's interest is so strong that he's even gone out and found Tim a wife. Because he sort of feels like you can't do it halfway, you can't really be in the church unless you're married to another believer. That for a believer to be married to a non-believer, it just won't work that way. And so, and Tim is, I think, he's really desperate for direction at this point in his life, and basically wants to prove to the pastor that he's going to do this wholeheartedly. And I'll just read you the first meeting between Tim and the woman that he eventually marries. Pastor Dennis had introduced them at a church picnic shortly after Tim had found his way to the tabernacle and been reborn in Christ. "There's someone I want you to meet," he said. "I think you'll like her." Tim was pleasantly surprised when the pastor led him over to the condiment table, where a folk-singery blonde was struggling with a big Costco bag of plastic forks, spoons, and knives that didn't seem to want to open. Unlike most of the single women who worshipped at the tabernacle, She was young and reasonably cute, with long straight hair and startled-looking blue eyes. Pastor Dennis relieved Carrie of the troublesome bag. "You're fired," he told her. "Now get out of here. And take this guy with you, okay?" Carrie smiled sheepishly at Tim, wiping the back of her hand across her sweaty forehead. "Hey," she said, "you're the guitar player." And Tim is on the praise team at church, and so she knows him from that. "Hey, you're the guitar player." "Bass," he corrected her, momentarily distracted by Pastor Dennis, who was having no more luck with the bag than Carrie had. He was tugging at it with both hands, grimacing fiercely, like a man trying to rip a phone book in two. "Gosh darn it," he muttered. "That's really thick plastic," Carrie warned. With one final heroic grunt, the pastor tore the bag asunder, unleashing a mighty cascade of utensils all over the table, including a few knives that landed in a bowl of bean dip. Tim and Carrie tried to help him with the mess, but he shooed them away. "I'm okay," he insisted. "You two go and get acquainted. I bet you have a lot in common." They sat in the shade, drinking lukewarm soda, watching the kids tie themselves together in preparation for a three-legged race. The Tabernacle was a relatively new church at that point. It had only been planted for 2 years, after Pastor Dennis and a handful of disaffected families had split off from the Living Waters Fellowship in Gifford Township, which he accused of being a namby-pamby, touchy-feely bunch of mealy-mouthed hypocrites who loved their cable TV better than they loved Jesus Christ. So there were only about a dozen contestants in the race, ranging in age from 5 or 6 to 12 or 13. On the whole, Tim couldn't help thinking, they were an unprepossessing bunch. The boys scrawny and somber, the girls overdressed for such a hot day, visibly uncomfortable, nothing at all like the confident little jockettes Abby played soccer with. They stood at slouchy attention, nodding earnestly as youth pastor Eddie explained that sin was like a third leg, a foreign growth that hobbled us on our walk through life. If we could just cut ourselves loose from it, we'd run like the wind, with our Savior at our side. It was an interesting metaphor, and it didn't seem to spoil anyone's enjoyment. When the first heat began, the little kids leapt forward, managing a few herky-jerky steps before squealing in alarm and toppling onto the grass with their partners. After a few seconds of hilarity, they untangled themselves, got up, and started over, dragging that extra limb around as best they could. "You've had such an interesting life," Carrie told him. "I haven't done hardly anything." As far as he could tell, she wasn't exaggerating. She was a 24-year-old woman raised in a strict evangelical home who hadn't gone to college or even lived on her own. She rarely dated, had no close friends outside the church, and spent her days running the office of a Christian insurance agent who was a friend of the family. The way she described it, the only act of defiance she'd ever committed was to follow Pastor Dennis to the Tabernacle against the wishes of her parents, who'd stayed behind at Living Waters. It made sense that she'd be intrigued by Tim's checkered past, especially the rock bands he'd played in when he was her age. "That must have been incredible," she said, as if he'd told her that he'd climbed Mount Everest or fought in a war. "I can't even imagine." "It seemed like fun at the time," he conceded, "but I was selfish. I hurt a lot of people." "But now you're saved," she told him, "so it's okay." For a second or two, he wasn't quite sure if she was putting him on. It happened to him a lot in his first few months at the Tabernacle, before he'd spent a lot of time with hardcore Christians. He'd gotten so used to hanging around with wise-asses, liars, and addicts that he was easily thrown off balance when someone spoke to him in a forthright manner, without doubt or irony. "It's wonderful," he said, "but I'm carrying a lot of guilt around." He told her about Allison and Abby and the regret he lived with every day. "We lost a house," he said. "I put the mortgage payments up my nose." "I'm a sinner too," Carrie told him. He nodded, understanding that her intentions were good, even if what she was saying was pure bullshit. Christian boilerplate designed to make people like him feel a little better, a little less alone. "You don't look like a sinner," he told her, glancing toward the field where the second heat had just begun. The 11-year-old Rapp twins, Mark and Matthew, were running in perfect unison, sprinting way ahead of the pack, as if their third leg were the most natural thing in the world. Carrie laughed, a little more loudly than he expected, and touched him lightly on the arm. "Doesn't matter what you look like," she assured him. If he hadn't known better, he might have thought she was flirting with him. matters what you do. And I'll just finish with the sort of crucial event in the plot. This is the thing that incites really the whole novel. It wasn't true, as certain people insisted in the weeks that followed, that Ruth had gone to Shakamakan Park that morning looking to cause trouble. In fact, trouble was the furthest thing from her mind as the ref blew the whistle to end the game, giving the Stars a hard-fought 3-2 victory. "We did it," Arlene cried, hugging Ruth and jumping up and down at the same time. "I can't believe we did it." "What a game," Ruth said. "The girls just didn't give up." She was surprised at how exhilarated she felt, proud of Maggie mainly, but also mysteriously validated as a parent. And these good feelings even spilled over onto Frank as he approached with a cockeyed grin on his face. "Can you believe your daughter?" he asked. "Is she amazing or what?" Ruth was about to launch into her own rhapsody of agreement, but she checked herself when she saw that Eliza, this is Ruth's older daughter, had wandered over from the picnic table to join them. "You missed quite a game," Frank informed her. She shrugged. "How'd Maggie do?" "Good," Ruth said. "They won." Eliza nodded, and Ruth could see the struggle it took for her to produce even a half-hearted smile. "Cool," she said. Ruth's heart went out to her. Eliza was going through a rough patch. The divorce had shaken her. The newspaper stories about Ruth had mortified her, and puberty had knocked her for a loop. "She did good?" Frank asked. "Are you kidding me? She kicked ass out there." Eliza's only reaction was to tug her upper lip over her lower one, a strange habit she had developed in the past few months. "Can we go now?" she asked her father. "I'm starving." "We didn't really have time for breakfast this morning," Frank explained. "I promised the girls I'd take them to dinner after the game. You can come with us if you want." Ruth was tempted, but she and Frank had agreed to have as few family outings as possible to avoid misleading the girls about the possibility of their getting back together. "No thanks," she said. "I gotta go. I'm just going to say goodbye to Maggie." She kissed Eliza on the cheek, then headed across the field just as the Comets lost into their obligatory post-game cheer. 2, 4, 6, 8. Who do we appreciate? Stonewood Heights. Stonewood Heights. Yay. The Stars hadn't done their cheer yet. They were sitting cross-legged in a circle on the grass, holding hands, looking unexpectedly solemn as they listened to whatever it was Tim Mason and John Roper were telling them. The coaches were part of the group, and that just made it cuter. The two grown men holding hands with the complete lack of self-consciousness they displayed while dancing at halftime. Until Ruth realized what they were doing, at which point it wasn't cute at all. "Excuse me," she called, quickening her pace. "Just a minute." Several girls turned at the sound of her voice, including Maggie. Ruth caught the warning look in her daughter's eyes, the silent plea for her to just please keep out of this, but she didn't slow down. Tim Mason ignored her approach. He kept his eyes on the ground and spoke in a low voice. "In all the blessings he has bestowed upon us, our parents, our families, all the material." "Hello," Ruth interrupted. "You can't do this." The coach stopped talking and looked up. "This is ridiculous," Ruth continued. "These aren't your children." The glance he returned wasn't defiant, but it was calm and unwavering. "Join us," he said. "You're more than welcome." "Maggie," Ruth said, her voice harsher than she meant it to be. "You get away from there." "Mom," said Maggie. "Ruth," said John Roper, "calm down." Tim Mason looked at Maggie. "She needs to hear this," he said. "So do you." "You don't know me," Ruth told him. "Don't tell me what I need." "You're no different from anyone else," he replied. "We all need the same thing." Ruth was startled by the surge of anger that coursed through her. It was as if everything she'd swallowed over the past 6 months, the abuse, the insults, the humiliation, had gathered into a fiery ball that was rising from her belly into her throat. She grabbed Maggie by the arm, jerked her to her feet, and yanked her out of the circle. "It's okay, Mom," Maggie whispered. "It's really okay." The softness of her daughter's voice threw her for a second, and she wondered if she'd done the right thing. But she had. She knew she had. She took a deep breath and pointed her finger at the coach. "I'll tell you what I need," she said. "I need you to stay away from my kid." Thanks. Thank you. So I'm happy to take questions on just about anything. Yeah, the question was about my the way that the people of the tabernacle are described in the book, and it's not part of my background. I grew up Catholic and am not a particularly religious person now. But to write the book, as I said before, I really wanted to be inside the heads of people on both sides of this divide. And I did a fair amount of research, which included going to church and reading the Bible. I went to Promise Keepers, went to an abstinence rally, and I spent a lot of time on the internet where there are Christian message boards and people talking to one another. So really, just as a writer, just needed to kind of take in the language, which, as you say, is not my natural language. But the important thing, I think, for me as a writer is just to start with a character that I know. So Tim could have walked out of my novel, The Wishbones, which is about these guys who are, about in their early 30s, and they're rock musicians who've ended up in a wedding band, and it's sort of a comic novel, but it's about, what it means when you get like a little too old for the thing that you love to do. And so I felt like I knew Tim and I knew his background, and then it was really a matter of just imagining the struggles that a guy like this would have with what the pastor was trying to get him to do. And so I just, I think that part of it is so rather than do tons of research and try and filter that, I started with the character and just tried to think my way into the story that way. And I think it helps that way, because if you know the character, you'll understand exactly what might trip him up, but why this might be necessary for him at this point in his life. And I think it makes the book less what it appears. First it appears to be a clash between this liberal person over here and this evangelical person over there. But I think what they discover ultimately is that they have a lot more in common than they thought they did. Yes, sir.
Congratulations on your cover position in the New York Times review of books. Did you get a chance to read it?
I did. Yeah, I was thrilled with that review. Everyone should read it.
My question, a lot of times I'll read a review and this seemed to be very positive, but I was curious what your reaction was.
Well, I was really happy with that. I think I have an interesting problem as a writer, and that is that most people first encountered my work not on the page, but as the movie Election. And I will be the first to admit that the movie is a lot funnier than the book. I mean, the movie is really funny. And as a result, I've been labeled as satirist. And there's some elements of satire in my work, but I don't think it's the predominant one. I actually think I'm a realist, and I'm very interested in character. And so one thing I've noticed, the book has been reviewed quite widely and mostly very well, but the people who don't like it tend to feel like it's a failed satire rather than a successful, serious novel. And so that review, I thought, really made a case for it as a serious novel. And in particular, really spoke about the divided nature of the characters, and the way that the book moves between two languages, this sort of secular language and this religious language. And I was really extremely happy with it for that reason, because I do wrestle with that sometimes. People have expectations that the experience is going to be funny and even maybe a little mean, because I think Election was funny and a little bit mean, and that's just not. If you read the book Election, I think you'll find it to be quite similar in many ways, but in tone, quite different. So that review, and there's another one in the Wall Street Journal actually that deals with it on a similar level, and it was actually written by a professor of religion that I was particularly pleased by, because again, it understood that the portrayal of the tabernacle in the book isn't meant to be satirical. Yes.
A couple of questions about movie adaptation, because both of these movies I thought got great reviews, and I enjoyed both of them very much. Were you pleased with the adaptation, number one? Number two, I was also wondering, at what stage do you find out that they're going to adapt and make your book into a movie?
Yeah.
And are they going to do that with this one? Have you already think about this?
Yeah.
Like a good one, Joe?
Yeah, okay, well, it's very interesting. There's three questions about movie adaptations. The first, I've been very lucky. I think the two movies made from my books, Election and Little Children, are terrific movies. And actually, as I was saying before, very instructive for me personally, because I think there's a combination of comedy and seriousness in each of the books. And in Election, Alexander Payne, who I think is a brilliant filmmaker, really heightened the comedy and, made the film a little less serious in the book. Whereas Todd Field in Little Children really heightened the drama and the darkness, and really, I think the movie is far less funny than the book. But it sort of taught me something about the mix in my own work, because I think it's hard for other people to do both of those things at once. They tend to have a kind of interest in one side of the work or the other. But I think I've been lucky to find I work with these producers, Albert Berger and Ron Yerxa, and they're the ones who find the directors, and they've been, two of the best directors of my generation, I think, Alexander Payne and Todd Field. And they also produced Little Miss Sunshine, and they got this book to the directors of Little Miss Sunshine, Jonathan Dayton and Valerie Faris, and so I'm now adapting it with them. So I think, to me, that's the secret, is to get good filmmakers to do it, and to make the movies relatively inexpensively, so that you don't get a lot of pressure from the studios to distort them for popular consumption. So right now I've been on a really nice streak with that. Election was the odd one, because that was a book I wasn't able to publish at the time. I wrote it in 1993. It didn't get published till 1998, and it got published because my publisher heard that it was going to be a movie, and suddenly became very interested in it. And that happened, and that sort of was the big break for me as a writer, in the sense that these producers called me about my book, The Wishbones. They'd heard about it through a friend, and I wasn't done with it at the time. And I just thought, I've got these Hollywood producers on the line. I should try and make something happen. And I said, listen, I have a book, and it's just been sitting on my shelf for a few years, and I think it would actually make a pretty good movie. And I thought that they would be skeptical because it was unpublished, but actually they were very pleased that it was unpublished, because it meant that nobody else in Hollywood had seen it. And that's producers only have these materials that's what they have to sell at that point. And so they were thrilled to get it, and it happened very quickly. They got it to MTV. It was optioned. The first writer-director they went to was Alexander Payne. He said he would do it. He wrote a script. Everybody loved it, and boom! The book barely beat the movie. But so that was like a kind of a magic trick. I sent some paper to California, and this movie came back. But with Little Children, I was completely involved. I wrote the script with the director and had a much more up close experience in terms of how a movie gets made, and it was more satisfying for me in the sense that I really felt like I was part of the team that created it. But I was also entangled in what is really a very contentious business, because you have all these people with different agendas, coming together and doing something, and inevitably there's a lot of conflict, and so you have to be prepared for that. So it's both, a much more satisfying experience, but a much more complicated experience. But I do like being involved and being part of a collaborative effort, because the job of writing novels is a somewhat solitary one. And it's nice to be working with other people. Yes?
Years since I've seen the film and read the book, but the ending of the movie is different than the ending of the book. I don't remember now exactly what it was. Can you talk a little bit about how that transformation occurred in life?
Yeah, the question was about the difference in the ending of Little Children in the book and the movie. It's funny because in that case, the ending tracks the book very closely until, one dramatic moment. And what happened there was exactly what happened with Election, but in Election, an entirely new ending got written. And what happens is, in general, in both cases, a script was written that had the faithful ending to the book, and it ran into resistance from various people involved with the project. I tend to end my books in a very quiet note. And there's some feeling with film that it shouldn't end quietly, that it should end with some dramatic climax. And because it's a much more concentrated form, a novel is a kind of solitary experience. You can read it over the course of weeks, depending upon how quickly you read. And I think, anyway, there was just some feeling that these quiet endings weren't going to satisfy viewers. And in the case of Election, it was a result of test screenings, which is a common thing. Movies are made and they're shown to test audience who fill out cards. Sometimes they actually turn these knobs to map their emotional responses. But in this case, the test audience really hated my ending. And the studio basically told the director that he needed to come up with another one. This is for Election. And over the course of several months, a new ending came, the ending in which Matthew Broderick moves to New York and throws his Coke at Tracy's limo. And he basically, that ending is the exact opposite of the ending of the book, where the characters kind of meet a year later and have an oddly revealing conversation with one another, where they both realize that it's not the other person who's the problem, it's themselves. And it's really kind of a sweet thing, and she asks him to sign her yearbook. And it's a moment of reconciliation and understanding, and these characters have grown out of the situation that caused them so much trouble. In the movie ending, it's much more satirical because they still are exactly the same. And they still hate each other. And there's this sense of, much more this sense of, people will never change. They're doomed to make the same mistakes over and over again. And it actually works as an ending to the movie, which is much more satirical than the book. So it's sort of funny for me as the writer to feel like it's a really great ending for the movie, but it's complete opposite of the ending that I started with. With Little Children, I would say that in essence it's the same ending, except that something truly dramatic and horrible happens, replacing basically the same event. that's a moment of quiet understanding. So I don't want to spoil it for anyone who hasn't seen it, because it is a kind of a shocker. And that was a special case in that, the movie hadn't been filmed and it wasn't tested, but the studio was saying, we don't like this quiet ending. We really want something much more dramatic that's going to cap off the action, because the movie is quite suspenseful in its last third, and there was a sense that suspense needs somehow to be, broken. And there's a Saturday morning when the director called me up and said, I've got our ending. And he told me what he planned to do, and I thought he was joking, because it just seemed so extreme. And he just kept, and I laughed it off, and he kept calling me back for days saying, what do you think, what do you think? And I finally realized he was serious, and had to think my way through it, and really took a kind of a leap of faith. I said, if you really think this is the way to go, I'm willing to give it a try. And I honestly still don't know how I feel about the very last 2 or 3 minutes of Little Children. Some people really like it, some people think it's too much, but that's part of what collaboration is. And I didn't have a better idea, and it was a very strong idea that he had, and he believed in it really passionately. So we went with that. Oh yeah.
You write female characters so well and so convincingly. Is that you're one of the few male authors I wait for you to I love your writing. Do you have a lot of close female friendships? Does your wife read your manuscripts when they're in drafts? And that's the second part of the question. Who do you let read your manuscript when it's in when you're writing, as opposed to when you turn it in to your editor? Or do you let your editor?
Yeah, no, I only basically my wife reads it, and then I send it in to my agent and editor. I don't have a whole lot of. I don't have like a writing group or other writers who I get a lot of feedback from. And it's because I think I basically know what I want it to look like, and if I have a problem, I'll just work on it till I think that I've come to terms with it. As for the women characters, I do think that I get a lot of information from my wife in the sense that, women tell each other lots of things, and so she'll sort of report. And so in that sense, I do hear it. But I think, I really learned to do it in election, because I've been writing, like my book, Bad Haircut, is just basically a guy's book. It's really about boys growing up. And when I was writing election, I had all these different points of view, and I knew that the female characters had to be as strong as the male characters, otherwise the book would be strange. And I was really like scared, because I have Tammy, this character. She's a 16-year-old lesbian, and I thought, how am I going to do that? How am I going to write this character whose experience is so different from my own? And the solution that I came to was to make her actually more like the kid I was than anybody else in the book. Like I just remembered a certain kind of, wise, smart guy alienation that I had in high school, and I just gave it all to her. And it made me feel very close to her, and it somehow made me able to, as long as I can find some way into the character, some element of commonality, like even say Tracy's ambition in election, I was, I had some little bit of that as well, and Ruth and Sarah in Little Children, had this sort of failed academic backstory that was similar to my own. I just always try and find, even with the female characters, some element of commonality that I just need a little bit to feel like I'm connected to this character and I know them, and I have this sort of, this one note that I can always rely on as sort of their bedrock character. And it's just similar to what I was saying with Tim, but that's sort of my method with all the characters, to find some way in that's just to feel like, it's a matter of confidence sometimes, not to feel like they're strangers or they're unknowable. So I just have to give myself like a key for each character.
Is your wife a harsh critic?
No, she's the best kind of critic, because I don't like to be criticized. So what I have to do is like listen to, I just know all the inflections to the phrase, I love it. So she loves it all, but I understand what she hates. It's just important that it works that way. So remember, you all love it. Yeah.
Did you do any writing when you were an undergraduate at Yale?
Did I do any writing when I was an undergrad? I did. I'm one of those. Actually, I wonder if it's rare or not. If you met me my freshman year of college and you asked me what I wanted to do, I would have said I want to be a writer, which I think is actually. I don't always recommend that to other people. I think it's great to have a kind of period where you're exploring life and figuring out what you want to do. On the other hand, people who know what they want to do have a leg up in the sense that I went to college and I studied very seriously. I read a whole lot and I thought hard about what I wanted to do. I then went to graduate school. Once I got in my 30s and began to have some success and be able to make a living as a writer, I did feel like, boy, I worked so hard those years. I never really traveled. I never really had a kind of, carefree, youth. But on the other hand, I was, I did have a kind of very focused period of, apprenticeship or development. So, we're ready to go?
Well, we're about out of time.
Okay.
Unless there's a compelling question.
Oh, better be compelling. All right, well, thanks so much. I really appreciate it.